That's the other unique thing about narcissists is that they move from idealized to suddenly you're devalued and there's no going back. You're go from all good to now you're all bad. Some of us get into toxic relationships because of our personality traits. No, we're not codependent. We may be echoistic. Today, Lynn Strathdee joins me to talk about how these personality characteristics can negatively affect relationships and maybe even attract narcissists. Well, Lynn Strathdee, I'm so excited to have you back on Breaking Free from Narcissistic Abuse because we had a fascinating conversation last time about echoism. I know that's something that most people have never heard of. I mean, absolutely never heard of, but I think it's a bigger problem than most of us realize. And so today I'd like to get into not only just a reintroduction of what it is, but how maybe you think it develops, because I think that's important because there's, I think, a couple different pathways, but also what is its implication in relationships? What happens to us when we get in a toxic relationship if we have any of these characteristics? So thank you so much for being back today.
Hi, Kerry. It's really lovely to be back. Lovely to see you again.
So tell me from the get-go, because I know some of us have never heard of the word echoism. What is it in a nutshell, and what does it look like in a relationship?
Sure. I think it's ironic that we don't talk about echoism because it's as ubiquitous as narcissism. It's just that the term itself is unfamiliar. It's not that echoism per se is either uncommon or not as frequently seen as narcissism. In fact, you can think about every single element of narcissism, you can apply that to echoism. Echoism is essentially, if we have narcissism as a personality type that is essentially self-focused and constantly self-orienting and having itself as the kind of center of gravity, if you like, the kind of the focal point. The echoist is the opposite of that, is literally kind of other-centered. So it's almost like the person's priorities and center of gravity, their kind of driving force is externally driven as opposed to internally driven. And just like narcissism, you could have that, everyone, if they're healthy, is going to be at some points in their life self-focused and self-serving in the true sense of the word, looking after oneself, caring for oneself. And at times, of course, we have to be appropriately looking after and caring for other people and prioritizing their needs. But as you know, in more extreme cases, you can have people that are so self-orienting and so self-focused that it's really, really damaging for other people. And of course, the same is true of echoism. The reason that I think it's got lost really is that we've been using for years now in mental health, and I've been in recovery for most of my adult life. So one way or another, even though my therapy practice is very new, I've been in this sphere, if you like, for decades. But we have so many different terms for what I think the concept of echoism captures so brilliantly, and which narcissism also captures brilliantly in a single term. We have codependent, we have empath, we have highly sensitive person. Some people will sort of think about echoism in that respect. We also have people pleaser.
People pleasing, yeah.
Thank you, people pleaser. And I think it's not that we haven't been talking about echoism this whole time. We have. Every time somebody's talking about one of those terms plus the narcissist, which they usually are, aren't they? Mm-hmm. I think what they're doing essentially is picking one element of echoism and calling that the thing. So they'll say, oh, it's the codependent and the narcissist and the codependent, or it's the narcissist and the people pleaser. But actually, people pleasing, codependency, being highly sensitive, being highly empathic, they're all elements of echoism and fall under that umbrella. And I think it's much more helpful to think of narcissism and echoism rather than narcissism and then all these different kind of elements, behaviors, traits, and so on.
Right, right. We almost have fragmented, trying to capture an essence of something, and we have all these labels that...
We have.
Yeah.
And people get confused then. Hold on, does that mean it's a pathology? If we've got pathological narcissism, does that mean echoism's a pathology? I would argue you can be so damagingly other-focused that it's pathological to yourself.
Yeah.
Just not to other people, which is why it doesn't necessarily require any kind of DSM label necessarily, but it's extremely damaging.
I think of the story of Narcissus and Echo. I mean, I think that's a really great example,
well, that's
which is
where it
comes from. Yeah, it comes from the Greek tragedy, which Echo becomes, she's a nymph. She falls in love and she becomes fixated. Granted, she's cursed, but she's fixated to a spot where she gets rooted into that spot. Is that true, or am I mixing that up with Narcissus? He becomes a flower. He gets fixated.
He becomes a flower. She's fixated with him, absolutely.
Yeah.
But she's originally cursed because she's talking a lot. She's chattering. And she's cursed for distracting Juno, who was Zeus's wife. He was playing away from home with other women, and she distracted his wife from noticing what he was up to. So Juno cursed Echo for the fact that she distracted her, and as a result she'd missed what her husband was up to, his kind of playing away from home. And as a result she said, right, well, that's it, you're not going to speak. If you do speak, you'll only ever be able to repeat what someone else says. And of course, Narcissus, extremely beautiful young man who a lot of people were enamored by, but he was the person that she then saw, fell in love with, and was completely obsessed with. And I think this idea of an ideal love, because Narcissus was as obsessed with a kind of ideal love with himself, but she was totally fixated on this idea of an ideal love with him, but could only ever express herself through what he was saying. And he was the only person that she was paying any attention to. So his were the words that she was always repeating.
Right. So she became other focused to the point that she's a reflection of his last few words. I mean, you start to think about the fact that she becomes a container for his speech even.
Literally. So it's not that the feelings weren't there. It's not that she didn't have any identity. It's that she couldn't express it. Yeah. So it's not an absence of desire or an absence of imagination or any of those things. It's just that she physically didn't have the capacity to articulate her own thoughts and feelings. And I think that's a very important aspect of echoism. Echoistic people, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm describing, like I said a minute ago, this new entity of people. I'm not. I'm just describing people that there have always been, who are full of their own feelings and thoughts, but are very frightened of articulating them, particularly when there's someone who's a more dominant, more self-confident, more pushy, more out there character. A lot of people find the idea of pushing back or saying something different goes right out the window the minute that they're standing in front of somebody who needs them to just hum the tune.
Right.
Toe the party line.
I was going to ask you for a practical example, because I think that will even help make this clearer for people. So let's say that we have somebody, a strong woman who's running the house, or maybe not even, she doesn't appear strong, but she's using her femininity in a strong way. And he feels like he's being targeted by her, that he can't do anything right. He gets emasculated for any efforts that he tries. Everything he does, she kind of corrupts and attacks. She plays the guilt game, really makes it very passive aggressive. And he feels like he's powerless. He's sort of stuck at home. So what might be a scenario in which the narcissistic wife then centers herself and that the echoistic husband is then left to responding? Can you can you jump in there and help play out a scenario like that?
Yeah, I think a scenario, any kind of domestic scenario, particularly what you've just said, where someone's had a long period of that, where the relationship has sort of been built on a bedrock of, or a foundation of, one person diminishing and demeaning somebody else's experience to the point when they do say something, it's not taken seriously, it's not respected, and nothing happens. So in that kind of context, say, for example, they're out as a couple, they're going out for dinner somewhere, and the husband notices that she is behaving quite flirtatiously, or she is doing something that makes him feel less than or disrespected maybe, and to say something about that, to challenge it. It's very, very easy for that dominant woman to turn around and make him feel like he's the one that's making it up, that he's exaggerating, that he's insecure. It's exactly what we see in all the narcissistic abuse stuff that you talk about on your channel, where somebody brings their feelings, and when they're diminished or rejected by a dominant person, an echoistic person, rather than pushing back, will have a tendency to immediately just to kind of think, okay, well, I probably have got this wrong. Because I think anyone in a relationship with an abusive or dominant person will wind up in an echoistic position, even if they didn't start out in one. Does that make sense? Even a strong and healthy person, if that happens to them for too long, then of course that's going to be the position that they take. But I guess what I think you're sort of alluding to there is where somebody is naturally inclined to self-doubt, the chances are that they'll just go along with and start to assume that it is them that's got the wrong end of the stick, and then start to really question their own interpretation rather than trusting what they're feeling and actually pushing back so that there are either consequences or that things change, you know.
Right, because what I've noticed in these relationships is there's this fine edge that we walk between connection and abandonment. We want to stay connected, but we need to also at the same time protect the autonomy of the individuality of the individual. What happens with a narcissist is they will protect their individuality to the extent of betraying the relationship. They're not invested in maintaining the relationship. Where to me, the echoistic person is so invested in preserving the connection because that's how I almost feel like it's how they preserve themselves. They preserve the relationship to preserve themselves. I mean, you think back to the story of Echo, she has no voice. Her only voice is to repeat another voice of somebody else. So in that moment, if there's no voice to repeat, does she have a voice? I mean, yes, internally, but she doesn't really feel like she does. So that often a lot of us get into these relationships and feel like, well, if I don't make the effort, then we won't be together. I mean, it's always being threatened. And so this is the way that I preserve the connection is by living through the other person. Not even that I'm giving in. It's more than that. It's more than just giving in. It's like living through the other person.
Definitely. I think there's a bit that we don't talk about with codependency, empath, and people pleaser that we don't talk about that you've just touched on, which is really important. And if we can just leave aside for a minute that everything I'm saying about being with a dominant person or an abusive person, that's what happens to everybody. That's not just to echoistic people. But if we can just assume for a second that an echoistic person is going into it, as you rightly say, with a deficit in their sense of self and a sense of needing someone else to give them direction, give them a role, give them an identity, but also give them the security of someone else's opinions and position. There is a kind of existential element in echoism, like there is in psychology for all people. We're constantly having to decide, aren't we, throughout our lives, who are we? What are we? What's the right way to be in the world? And I think due to a lack of confidence, due to a lack of self-belief and a real fear of attack, of getting things wrong, an echoistic person would rather, as you say, stick with this dominant other person because then my role is defined, my role is delineated. And if it's wrong, I'm not in the firing line for attack from the outside because someone else is going to help to protect me if I get this wrong. Because I think fear of attack, psychological attack, emotional attack, I think that's a really important aspect of echoism. It's almost like an echoist will, certainly the clients that I work with, and I know that I've felt this for many, many years, because I can talk, as you know, and I'm a naturally very extrovert person, but a real fear of not being able to withstand external attack, and having to justify the decisions and so on.
I have a lot of echoistic tendencies, and I know that I do. And I definitely came from a home life that perpetuated that. And I would even love to get into that with you about that. It's like, how does this evolve? Because a lot of it's like, is it from our family of origin? Is it something that happens in a long-term relationship? Can it happen in a short-term relationship? But I know for me that I grew up in quite a hierarchical family with a lot of strong kind of overbearing Christian morals that were quite scary, very, threat of hell kind of thing. So you need to be toe the line. In fact, the saying in my family was, when we say to jump, what you're to do is not to just ask why, it's to figure out how high and how long you have to maintain it. So very compliant. We were trained to be extremely compliant. But for me, it's when you talked about being attacked, I think the fear is that I will be annihilated if there's that I'm not for sure I can withstand attack from another person. But then I look at other people and say, why are they able to? I'm not quite for sure why they seem to weather this better than I can.
Yeah. And I think this is where Dr. Peter Salerno's stuff has been so helpful, because if we come away from anyone who's not been trained in kind of object relations and things, we can think very simply about traits. Or neurodivergence. If you have a chaotic or difficult or very dominant environment, and as you know, I wasn't raised by abusive people, but there were elements in my childhood that felt like I needed to really adapt myself to my environment, and I had a specific set of traits. And if you're very, very sensitive and you're extremely aware and you're very empathic and very neurotic, and I know you've spoken at different times about, changes in neuroticism over the course of a lifetime, but if you're a very neurotic person, you're very agreeable, if you're very sensitive, and then you experience relational trauma, in my case, as I said, not narcissistic abuse, but I think a position that your personality inclines you to take, which is that my best way of dealing with this is to go along with stuff, because my neuroticism and my sensitivity mean that the idea of pushing back feels absolutely no way, because there just isn't the structure for me to cope with that afterwards.
Exactly, because neuroticism, for those who don't know what that means, it really means insecurity, wouldn't you think? Isn't it kind of a...
Yeah, and a tendency to depression, a tendency to worry, anxiety, definitely.
So if you're insecure about yourself, your accomplishments, your strengths, and somebody else stronger comes along and says, no, you've got that wrong, and you're highly empathic, and you're very self-reflective, you're like, well, maybe I did get it wrong, and I don't want to upset them. You can see how then you're going to place yourself in a more submerged, lower position than the other individual.
Absolutely right. And I think that's why Dr. Salerno's book was so brilliant for me in helping me to really kind of place echoism in a more up-to-date framework, which is if you have someone with the opposite traits, low in agreeableness, low in neuroticism, low in conscientiousness, in the face of certain environments, they're going to push back very differently than somebody who has high agreeableness, high neuroticism, high conscientiousness. And he doesn't talk about sensitivity, but I think sensitivity, I would argue that probably every echoistic person is, what Elaine Aron would define as an HSP, as a highly sensitive person. I think having high trait sensitivity is a big deal for children when they're not sure how to manage their emotions and maybe they don't have the support to manage their emotions.
So that leads people with this tendency, this echoistic tendency, to make wrong conclusions about interpersonal relationships. That's what I see over and over and over. I know that I do it with myself, is that I assume other people are as sensitive as I am. They're invested as much as I am in the best interest of the relationship. I'm not even for sure I'm all that concerned about the best interest of me, which is another sign of the echoism, is that I'm also not concerned with me either. But we make some wrong assumptions in relationships that tend to keep us trapped in these toxic relationships. Let's talk a little bit more about that. What have you seen in regards to this?
I think, as you rightly say, Kerry, I think this presumption that other people have the same way of thinking as you, the presumption that people make, I think probably we all do this, is to assume that I think this way, so I'm hoping that you think this way. I've noticed that there's very often a naivety and a suggestibility in echoistic people, a sense of a kind of innocence sometimes. But I think that makes it sound like it's all kind of hearts and flowers. I think in a way that naivety, I think sometimes is a way of avoiding, again, having to necessarily take responsibility and be more critical, possibly more grown up. There's something quite grown up about standing back and reviewing somebody's behavior before you jump all in. I think that urge for an ideal love, even in friendships, that urge to have this kind of honeymoon ideal situation isn't just in romantic relationships. And I think that inclines echoistic people to see those idealized traits in the other person without actually standing back maturely and saying, well, I'm going to wait and see what this person shows me before I just completely go all in and think that this is the person that, I have in my head that they are, sort of just more scrutiny, more objectivity.
I almost feel like for me that in that moment, I'm so invested in the relationship that I'm willing to forgo a lot of my own safeties, assuming the other person's forgoing the same level of safety. What I don't realize is that the other person is, if I pick a less kind, compassionate individual, a more selfish individual, that they're always in it for the benefit of themselves.
Yeah.
And I don't assume that. I assume that they're in for the benefit of the relationship and that somehow we're going to be okay. But it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, see, I don't know that I think of it. When I'm just thinking about this as you're speaking, I'm not sure that I necessarily, when it's a new person anyway, think, oh, I'm so invested in the relationship. But as I understand it and as I experience it, it's more like, well, if someone else thinks that what they're doing is okay, then it must be because they think it is, regardless of the fact that actually this doesn't sit right with me, just not even bothering to check in with whether it sits right with me. They're saying that this is okay. And I think there's a lack of checking in with yourself, as you rightly say, is this okay? Yeah. Am I sure? Have I even really thought about it?
Yeah, no, I don't have that same kind of confusion. Mine's more, I'm willing to betray that piece in order to preserve the relationship. I mean, I'm aware of it in the moment that's probably, I'm not really okay with that, but I'm willing to not make a big deal of it. I'm thinking of, for instance, I saw early on my ex chew out an airline attendant. It was somebody behind the counter, and he got quite loud with them. And then he came over and apologized to me. I know that was unsightly and maybe a little inappropriate, but they needed to give us better care. And I'm thinking, no, I'm not okay with it. But if I make a fuss here, it's going to have consequences to the relationship. I may cause a severance or like a breach in the relationship that I don't want to introduce because I'm not for sure how repairable it is. So I'm willing to sacrifice my integrity around this in order to preserve our connection. And that's what bothers me, is that why don't I just sort of like, no, I'm not okay with that, and then see what comes.
Yeah. Yeah. So what do you think? Why don't you say, well, no, I'm not okay with that? Because that would end it. That would end the relationship. Will there be sort of punishment or?
Well, yeah, because I think with certain types of people, and we know them, I think echoists are really good. This is what I think. Maybe I'm wrong. This is just me speculating. I think echoists are really good at picking out people who are brittle. That's how I put it. Like dangerously end things easily, rapidly, don't need other people. And that our need to have them see us. This is okay. Now I'm getting really like into myself. The need to have this person choose me somehow elevates me. Like, let's go back to the story of Echo. Why choose Narcissus' words? Okay, she loved him, but he was also one of the most beautiful men in the world. It wasn't just that she loved him. She could have picked a nerd and loved the nerd, but she picks him. And there's a part of the being seen by somehow this idealized object makes you feel more. Yeah. And in that experience with my ex, having his approval and love and acceptance made me feel more, that I didn't find it enough in myself for me to say, I don't need that. That's a bunch of, that's crappy. I'm not okay with that.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point. And you've touched on something that I don't think we speak enough about when it comes to echoism. And that is that it's not just, echoistic people pleasers, codependents, and that's that. It's that actually one of the most important things about echoism and why it's so useful is that echoists nearly always wind up in relationships with highly narcissistic people. And as you've just rightly said, these are people who can be idealized, albeit only initially when, it's the personality and the charisma, or maybe there's some aspect of that person that's being projected as ideal, which of course we're inclined to say, wow, that, whatever it may be that's being projected as ideal. And I think you're absolutely right that there is a kind of repressed grandiosity, an inverted grandiosity, which is that I'm not comfortable feeling my own idealness except through the eyes of this narcissistic other. So that's very alluring. It's very addictive because you feel like, well, I'm only really allowed to feel special and I'll let myself enjoy feeling special when it's through the eyes of this type of a person.
Yes. And I'm feeling shame now because this is how bad it got. He is a very handsome man. Maybe not, if I put every woman up in the world and say, rate him on a scale of 10. Okay, not everybody's going to give him a 10. But I'm going to tell you, he's definitely above a 6. Definitely. And we would all collectively agree this is a good-looking man. His beauty was such, and people think it was his sexuality. No, it wasn't his sexuality. It was his beauty. His beauty was such that sometimes I would ache in pain looking at him. That's how beautiful he was to me. And to have him see me somehow made me more. And how sad is that? Because I really need to echo repeating the words of Narcissus. I needed to find my own beauty and reside in that, not live in his beauty.
Yeah.
But I felt more beautiful because he chose me. And I didn't want to lose it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think that's a very important difference in when we talk about narcissistic abuse and relationships more generally, and this particular phenomenon, because this is a particular and quite specific phenomenon around a repressed sense of your own idealization, a real discomfort, allowing yourself to feel any of your own specialness. And that's where I do agree with Craig Malkin, but allowing yourself comfortably to experience it because someone else is giving that to you. But of course, when that person goes, they also take with them that sense of you being incredible. And we've all been in a relationship with someone who made you feel like you were just the most incredible thing. But it's a strange unconscious pattern. And it's talked about all over the place. It's just that it's not necessarily using this language.
Right.
A lot of people will say, yeah, I've had one narcissistic relationship after another, or friendship.
And then they'll say, I'm codependent. Like, no, I have a strong aversion to that word. I really don't like it.
But you touched on something a second ago as well about when you were growing up, and the need to be seen or the desire to be seen. And I've been really enjoying Jessica Benjamin's work on intersubjectivity, and she explores dominance and submission and the fact that using object relations, if we think about the child individuating, a little girl and a little boy trying to develop their own sense of who they are, the little girl is modeled after and sees herself as, similar to the mother. And whereas there's the Oedipal phase, the little boy and the father, she talks about little girls having, if the penis envy is to be thought of in any meaningful way, it's more around the disidentification with mother,
Yes.
because father represents freedom and the outside world.
Right.
But in some individuals, we need to know that we're real. We need to be recognized for our ability to assert ourselves. Some people will excessively assert themselves because they're not able to really be intersubjective. They're not really able to recognize the other, but they'll find someone who's going to recognize them. And I think echoists are exactly that. They perform the role of, I tell you what I'll do. I'll just recognize you. I'll just be here recognizing you, asserting yourself. And the narcissist will say, well, I'm just going to keep asserting myself and you're just going to have to keep recognizing me. But of course, in order for that recognition to be meaningful, the person has to be a person. You have to have some value.
Right.
If you diminish somebody so much that they have no value, then their recognition of you is meaningless.
Yes, I had a perfect example of it, and it was near the back end of our relationship. So he was in the devaluing phase. So there wasn't anything that I could do to redeem myself. That's the other unique thing about narcissists, is that they move from idealized to suddenly you're devalued, and there's no going back. You go from all good to now you're all bad. So I was in the all bad phase, and we met somebody, and we were chatting with them, another couple on vacation. And I was just looking at my ex, admiring him, respecting what he was having to say, appreciate it was smart, savvy, and just thought he was doing a good job. And I was admiring all of that. And that person stopped, the man stopped and said, oh, to have somebody look at me the way that she looks at you. So here's this person from the outside was able to admire the admiration and the love and the respect and wish to be under that kind of light with somebody. And yet my ex could not see it, nor enjoy it, nor experience it, because in his mind, it no longer mattered. Because I no longer mattered.
Yeah, because you've lost your value.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things she talks about brilliantly is the fact that the dominant needs the submissive person. There's an interesting parallel around this idea of the dominant person does need something from you, which is your recognition. Yeah. And if you don't recognize, then you're not doing your job. But also, if they need you, then that's a problem, so they have to diminish you, but just not too much.
Yeah, but they also resist their own dependency, too. The fact that they need you, they despise that as well. So then they hate you for that as well. So it's just, you're in this very big loss situation. So to wrap this up, because I know you and I could just go for hours on this topic.
100%.
So fast, is let's jump over to the podcast extra and talk about if you're recognizing that you are living through the other person, that you're really struggling to have much of a self, maybe even scared to take a stand because you're going to lose the connection. Let's talk about how to begin to practically do that. But how can people find you, Lynn? Where are you? Where can they?
Sure. My TikTok name is The Echo Chamber, and I'm on Instagram at The Echo Chamber 2024. I have a website called echoismrecovery.com, and there's a contact page on there. Anyone can send me an email or on social media. So, but most of my work is with clients,
that's what I was going to say. You do a lot of one-on-ones. So people can work with consultations and
Absolutely. Anyone can reach out. Of course they can. Yeah, sure.
All right. Thank you so much for being on today. This was a fascinating discussion.
Thank you, Kerry.
Well, that's a wrap for this week's episode. Are you following me on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube? You can find me at Kerry McAvoy, PhD. Or you can learn more about me and my resources, such as the Toxic Free Relationship Club, at kerrymcavoyphd.com. And I'll see you back here next week.